has had major internet problems. I'm not sure he's going to join us at all. So we're doing a little bit of a change. Lyn Julius is going to come on now. After Lyn has finished, we'll either have Fiaz or we won't. And if we don't have Fiaz, we'll have me telling you all about our future events, because there's quite a number of future events that we've got planned that are quite interesting and you don't yet know about them. So there's everything to wait for to listen to what I have to tell you. One or two of them are going to be quite exciting. But let's move on now to Lyn. Lyn, are you here?
I'm here.
We're both here.
Hi.
Can we share screen?
So
Yeah.
my pleasure to introduce Lyn Julius, who's going to talk to us about who the Mizrachim are and why they're so important. So Lyn Julius is the British-born daughter of Iraqi-Jewish refugees. She's a journalist, an author, a lecturer, and a blogger, and is the co-founder of Harif, an association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa in the UK. She's the author of Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. Published by Valentine Mitchell in 2018, and it's been translated into Norwegian, Portuguese, and Arabic. Lyn's going to talk to us for maybe 20 or 25 minutes, and then there'll be questions, and then don't leave at the end, because I'm going to tell you, assuming we don't get Fiaz, don't leave at the end, because I'm going to tell you all about our future events. Lyn,
Okay.
over to you.
Can we share screen, please, Gary?
Yeah.
Yes, you can. Charlie, do you know how to get that organised?
Yeah.
Yeah, you should be able to now.
Okay, can you everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much indeed, Gary, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be with NJA, and I recognize some faces on the call, and it's wonderful to be with you. So first of all, here's a plug for my book, which you kindly mentioned. And I will sort of race through my usual presentation, actually, because usually I do it in 45 minutes, but this has got to be a little bit quicker. Okay, so the main focus of my book, and I think this is a particularly important issue, is the 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries, often known as Mizrachi Jews or Oriental Jews, although it's a little bit complicated because some of the communities are Sephardi and Mizrachi. People use the word interchangeably with Sephardi, and it's too complicated. So, I mean, I tend to use the words interchangeably, Mizrachi and Sephardi, although it doesn't quite mean the same thing. Anyway, so what are we talking about? We're talking about the Jewish refugee issue, which is often overlooked, often ignored, often denied. But in fact, there was a larger number of Jewish refugees who had to flee Arab countries than there were Palestinians who left Israel. And the number of Jewish refugees was also...
Sorry, we lost you. Hello? Hello?
This is the sort of geographical area we're talking about. Can you hear me? Is everything all right?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Ah, okay. You couldn't hear me before.
We lost you for about 5 seconds.
Oh, sorry about that. I think it must be the local signal here. Okay, so we're talking about 10 Arab countries, from Morocco in the west right down to Yemen at the tip of Saudi Arabia there. I touch on Iran in my book, but it's not the main focus, because basically we're talking about those countries that were at war with Israel in 1948 and took their revenge on their Jewish communities. So if you look at the decline in the Jewish population in Europe, it's actually less dramatic than the decline of the Jewish population in Arab states. And here you see that the population of almost 1 million Jews has gone down to about 4,000 today. So that obviously did not have the same tragic consequences as the decline of the Jewish population in Europe. It did not end in genocide, but it was a massive ethnic cleansing within a generation and a half. Most Jews managed to get out alive, thankfully, but it has to be said that there were riots in several Arab countries and hundreds of Jews actually were killed. But the difference between what happened in Europe and what happened in Arab states is obviously that Jews had somewhere to go because the state of Israel already existed and was happy to take them in. So if you look at this chart here, this gives you an idea of the size of the communities in 1948, which had hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of Jews. And today you can count them on the fingers of one or two hands. And several communities have no Jews whatsoever. The other thing you notice is how very old the communities are. They go back at least 2,000 years, and some, like the Iranian and the Iraqi community, also known as the Babylonian Jewish community, go back 2,600 years to the destruction of the first temple and the first exile by the Babylonian king who took slaves from Jerusalem to Babylon, and that community stayed in existence continuously for 2,600 years up until about 50 years ago. And it goes without saying that these communities really are indigenous. And much more ancient than Islam, 1,000 years. They were established 1,000 years before Islam, and they are, they are the original inhabitants of these countries. And in fact, there's more biblical history. Almost as much biblical history in the region as there is in the land of Israel itself. And this is the tomb of Ezekiel, who was one of the biblical prophets, as you know. You can still see the Hebrew inscriptions in the burial chamber of the prophet Ezekiel. But if you look at this picture below, you can see that the whole site has been transformed into a mosque. It's a Shia mosque, and if a Jew turned up and wanted to visit the tomb of Ezekiel, he wouldn't be allowed in today. And this is actually what's happened to Jewish heritage. There is very little left. It's either been deliberately erased, or synagogues have been converted into mosques, roads have been constructed over cemeteries, and there's very little evidence of 2,000 years of Jewish presence today. So there is a myth that you often hear that Jews and Arabs or Jews and Muslims lived in peace and harmony together before the establishment of Israel. But this, of course, is a myth because the Jews had an inferior status to Muslims. They were never equal. In fact, they had to abide by certain restrictions, limitations. They had to pay a special tax, which was like paying the mafia. in a protection racket. You pay the mafia to leave you alone. In this case, you pay the ruler to protect you. And why would you need protecting? Well, there were episodes of violence against the Jews. You might have heard of that Jews actually lived in melas, which were protected or fortified quarters in towns, particularly in North Africa. And there was a good reason for that, because they were subject to violent episodes. Should I? Okay, so I will read you a short passage from my book to illustrate this humiliated dhimmi status. So in a similar way to their Ashkenazi counterparts in medieval Europe, Jews in Morocco were debarred from certain occupations by the Islamic guilds. As in Europe, they performed certain necessary economic functions like money lending and associated tasks like metalworking, which were deemed reprehensible or unlucky by the non-Jewish majority. The Jews were given the most menial of tasks, and one such job assigned to them was the salting of the decapitated heads of executed captives. In Yemen, the job of cleaning the sewage was done by... Hello?
Sorry.
Was done a subcaste of Jews. In Egypt today, the Christian Copts are the rubbish collectors. Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
We can hear you, but I don't know if this voice is coming from somewhere else. I'm not sure.
Okay. Oh, Ralph was just arrived. In Egypt today, the Christian Copts are the rubbish collectors. In 20th century Iraq, Christians also did menial jobs in conformity with their lowly status, like cleaning septic tanks. The small Sephardi community of Palestine was so abased under Muslim rule that a contingent of Ashkenazi followers of the false Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi seeking refuge in Jerusalem in 1700 refused to put up with the humiliation suffered by the Sephardim. The Arabs behave as proper thugs towards the Jews, one wrote. In Palestine, Jews were not allowed to worship freely at their holy places. The Mamluk rulers forbade them from treading beyond the seventh step on the staircase to the burial place of the patriarchs. In Hebron, nothing equals the misery and suffering of the Jews of Jerusalem, wrote Karl Marx. The Arabs, Turks, and Moors are the masters in every respect. To be a dhimmi was to be continually reminded of Islam's supremacy over Judaism and Christianity. Of course, Jews could rise to be courtiers and advisors to the ruler of the day. They could also make their fortunes, but their existence was really very precarious. And you never knew what the future would bring. And this was the reality, that Jews really did not have any rights, and they had to buy their rights by bribing their way through life. But all this changed quite dramatically in the 19th century with the European colonial era, which actually introduced equal rights. And so Jews and Muslims then enjoyed equal rights, legal rights. And at about the same time, there was a network of Jewish schools set up throughout the Muslim world, which actually introduced Western education. And this allowed a middle class to emerge in the Jewish communities, and the Jews became the backbone of the colonial administrations, and they became prominent in trade and banking, and they ran the railways and the postal service, and they also were great artists and musicians and actors. And their golden age was really the colonial era. but it was also a source of great resentment because the Arabs were left far behind, and the whole social structure had actually been overturned. And therefore, the inferior dhimmis were now acting as superior, if you like. And this is a kind of forgotten or ignored factor in the Arab-Israeli conflict we have today. You know, that the Jews should know their place. They should behave as dhimmis, and they certainly should not defeat Arabs in war. So the colonial era actually came to an end with the rise of anti-Semitism. There's a great deal of popular colonial anti-Semitism in places like Algeria. The Vichy regimes during World War II actually started implementing the first stages of the ethnic cleansing of the Jews in North Africa. But there was also another form of nationalism that, anti-Semitism that arose at this time, that associated with Arab nationalism. And this symbol here is that of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. They were inspired by Nazism, as you can see, and this party still exists today and is still very anti-Semitic. Now, Arab nationalist parties obviously wanted to achieve independence for Arab countries, but they had no place for minorities, and Jews were gradually marginalized and ushered towards the exit. Another form of anti-Semitism arose at this time with the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood we think of as a sort of contemporary phenomenon, but actually it was founded in Egypt in 1928. And its legacy is still with us today because basically the Muslim Brotherhood imported European ideas of Jewish conspiracy and control, which are still with us today. You only have to read the Hamas Charter to see the influence of European anti-Semitism there. The Muslim Brotherhood allied itself with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the Palestinian Mufti, in the 1930s. He was an ideological anti-Semite, not just an anti-Zionist. And the proof is that he incited a terrible massacre of Jews in Baghdad. Not so much, well, he did incite the riots in Palestine, obviously, in Hebron, in Jerusalem, in Sfat, in 1920, 1929. But he spent 2 years in Baghdad between 1939 and 1941, inciting against the Jews of Iraq. So that is basically pure anti-Semitism, because the Jews of Iraq had nothing to do with the Jews of Palestine. And the result was the the Nazi Arab alliance. The figure on the right-hand side was the German ambassador in Iraq during the 1930s, Fritz Grobber. And he had Mein Kampf translated into Arabic and serialized in Iraqi newspapers. And this is the famous meeting of Hitler with the Mufti in November 1941. The Mufti made no secret of his wish to exterminate all the Jews in his sphere of influence when the Nazis won the war. And he became a guest of Hitler. He stayed in Berlin for the rest of the war, having been expelled from Iraq by the British. And he broadcast poisonous Arab propaganda anti-Jewish propaganda, kill the Jews wherever you find them. And this obviously had an effect on basically an illiterate population all over the Arab world. And he also set up Muslim SS divisions, and there is a myth that the Holocaust didn't affect Jews in Arab countries. It is an absolute myth. In fact, Tunisia came under Nazi control for 6 months in 1942, and Jews did end up in concentration camps in Europe. For instance, Libyan Jews who were sent to Bergen-Belsen. And there were labor camps in Morocco too, which today actually has a very positive image. But in fact, there's another myth which we need to explode, and that is that anti-Zionism came, it was the creation of Israel that actually caused anti-Semitism. But actually, if you look at the history, you will see that there were riots, there were pogroms, there were forced conversions even. And this is a riot or pogrom that took place in Morocco in 1912 in Fez. And when you consider the plight of other minorities in the Middle East, I'm talking about the Yazidis and the Copts and the Assyrian Christians, all those minorities have suffered, and yet they had no Israel of their own. We come to the establishment of Israel, 1948. 2 days after that, this article appeared in the New York Times, and it referred to an Arab League plan to persecute the Jews in Arab countries. So basically, the 5 Arab League countries declared war on Israel, and they declared a second war on their Jewish citizens. They brought in a raft of laws, discriminatory laws, stripping the Jews of their rights, dispossessing them of their property, and freezing their bank accounts, and above all, criminalizing Zionism. So this meant that every Jew was considered a potential Zionist and an enemy. And it gave the Arabs, license to arrest Jews, to imprison them, and even execute them. And this is very important because often people say, oh, well, conditions were different from country to country, and oh, some Jews left of their own free will, some might have been expelled, but some chose to leave, or the Zionists made them leave, or something like that. But in fact, all the Arab League countries adopted these discriminatory laws, and they considered their Jews as the Jewish minority of Palestine, the Jewish minority of the state of Palestine. In other words, they were going to punish their Jews for what was happening in Israel. And if people say, well, it's all very well that these Jews were expelled, yes, but the Palestinians have nothing to do with it. Well, here you have the proof that the Jews were considered part of the conflict. And in fact, 2 sets of refugees emerged from the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it just so happens that roughly equal numbers exchanged places in the Middle East. So what happened? Well, pressure built up for the Jews to leave because they were actually hostages to the first Arab-Israeli war. And Israel mounted rescue operations. For instance, here you see the Yemenite Jews being airlifted to Israel, and they did so without fear because they just read in the previous week's parasha that God himself was going to take them on eagle's wings and bring them to Israel. The Jews were effectively expelled. I mean, this is a laissez-passer that was issued to an Iraqi Jew, and the stamp on the left-hand side reads, "One way, no return." And this is an Egyptian laissez-passer issued to an Egyptian national, a Jew who was an Egyptian national and was singled out because he was Jewish and was made to leave. So obviously there was a huge amount of dispossession, especially in Egypt and Iraq. It is estimated that the Jews lost 50% more in terms of assets and property than the Palestinians. And I've heard it said that the Jews lost land equivalent to Jordan and Lebanon. So all this puts into perspective these disputes, you know, even over settlements in the West Bank, when you consider the enormity of what was lost by these Jews. And in fact, if you go to Cairo, there are so many ambassadors' residences which were once Jewish owned. For instance, the Russian ambassadors, the Pakistani, the South Korean, the Swiss, the German, the Canadian, the Dutch, just to give you an idea. And these are all the properties that were Jewish owned around the main square in Cairo. So what happened to these Jews? Well, 650,000, in other words, a majority, ended up in Israel. And what they did was they doubled the population of Israel virtually overnight. And Israel, being a very poor developing country at the time, didn't have the housing, it didn't have the jobs, it didn't even have the food for these people. So it put them in tent camps or mabarot. So if people say, oh, well, these Jews were never refugees, nonsense. They were put in tent camps. And some of these camps stayed in existence for decades and gradually turned into proper towns. For instance, Derot, that we hear of in the south. About 200 of these camps actually were in existence. And this is a wedding invitation to a hut in a tent camp. Of course, the big question is, why don't we hear this story? We never hear Israeli spokesman, I'm sorry to say, mention it. We're always on the defensive, you know, we work within the Arab agenda. We never talk about the expulsion of the Jews. We never say that it's the Arabs who are practicing apartheid, you know, having persecuted and expelled almost all their minorities. And actually, Israel has a lot to answer for it because the narrative has not been taught in schools. And this artwork shows you how few pages in a school textbook were devoted to the history and heritage of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Things are changing slowly. How am I doing? Sorry. Okay. But there is obviously every cloud has a silver lining, and the expulsion was actually a blessing in disguise. No Jew would want to return to the countries they came from, and this, of course, is a very important argument a counter argument to the right of return claimed by Palestinians. And these are all prominent Mizrachim. I'm including Yitzhak Herzog, even though his mother was Ashkenazi, but she was actually born in Egypt. So these are all prominent Mizrachim who've made their names recently. And my last point really is that the Jews ought to be, it ought to be recognized that the Jews are part of a rich tapestry of indigenous peoples living in the region. And some of these peoples have been claiming their own state. For instance, the Kurds. The Jews are just another indigenous people with a right to self-determination, and political rights ought not to automatically belong to the Arabs to the exclusion of other peoples. So that I will end on that note.
Lyn, thank you so much. Can I see anyone wants to ask questions? Could you please put your virtual hand up? I explained to you before how to do it. You go to the reaction box and you click on raise hand. I'm going to ask the first question. My question really is, what can we do about improving the situation in terms of knowledge of school children about the Mizrahi Jews? And I'm not just talking about here in the UK. There's probably a similar issue in the US and in other Western countries, where the entire history is probably not well known at all. I just want to think in terms of what your plans might be, or what Harif's plans might be to improve this.
Well, Harif is a very small organization composed of 5-6 volunteers. We do what we can to raise awareness of this story, but obviously we are very limited. And so what we want is the Ashkenazi-dominated communities to pass on the message for us, if you like, to sing from the same hymn sheet.
Yes.
I think Jewish schools need to do much more to educate the children, because they hardly get any education about Mizrahi Jews, as far as I know. So, it's something that the Ashkenazi community has got to take on board. I think it's absolutely vital. And Israel has to do more, because lately there have been some laws passed by the Knesset. We have a commemoration day on the 30th of November. I mean, all these are good things, but we really need a sort of grassroots movement to actually develop in Israel, and to sort of clamor for justice for these Jewish refugees.
Thanks, Lyn. I've got 3 questions. Jonathan, then Gary O, then Carl. Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Lyn. Very impressive and fascinating talk. As an Ashkenaz myself, I've just been reading in the Times of Israel that the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem is to be investigated for incitement to terror. Criminal probe. I wonder if you may have read it and what your reaction might be. Criminal probe okayed into Sheikh Ekrimah Sabri for telling family of Palestinian gunman who killed soldier that the status of a martyr is sublime and divine and to be aspired to. And there's a picture of him, which I can't share my screen.
Okay, well, actually, I didn't know that, but I am not in the least bit surprised, because there is a continuum from the Nazi era right through to today. Palestinian rejectionism has its roots in the Nazi era. Islamism, the anti-Semitism of Islamism has its roots in the Nazi era. So I would say that there's not an awful lot of difference between the Grand Mufti today and the Grand Mufti during World War II, unfortunately. But people don't see the continuum. I think they don't understand the roots of what we're up against. And in order to understand this, you have to understand what happened to the Jews in Arab countries.
Thank you, Lyn. Gary, you're on mute.
I know I'm on mute. Thank you.
You're off mute now.
Hi, Lyn. Thanks very much for your interesting talk. My question is a bit unfair. I've just recently read In Ishmael's House by Martin Gilbert. So I covers this topic. What am I, before I buy your book, what am I going to find in your book that I haven't found in Martin Gilbert's?
Oh, an awful lot. I mean, obviously, he is a very eminent historian. There's a lot of detail in his book. But my book is a bit different. It concentrates on the 20th century. He doesn't go into a great deal of detail in the 20th century. I also talk about the situation in Israel today, the culture wars, and the importance of this issue politically. And also I've got 21 stories, personal stories, from individual Jews that illustrate what it was like. So I think you'll find my book complementary to Martin Gilbert's book, if I could be so arrogant as to say that.
Thank you. It's great.
Yeah.
Okay, last question at the moment. There's still time for one or two more, but Carl, if you want to ask your question. You're on mute, Carl.
Yeah.
Carl, you are on mute. Could you come off mute, please?
Yes,
Great.
I'm here. I hope I'm loud and clear. Thank
You
you.
are now.
Thank you, Ms. Julius.
Mrs. Lawrence won't be very happy.
Thank you so much, Toda Rabba. And I enjoyed your hospitality a few weeks ago. And we value very much, all of us, your fantastic introduction, and it whets our appetite for more. So we'll definitely try to get your book. There is one or two topics I would like your opinion. When you first started your presentation, you listed the countries in the Arab world and how long Jews lived there, long before the Arab conquest, long before Islam was invented. There is one missing country, Saudi Arabia or Arabian Peninsula. Jews lived there, and as we know that, and it became quite a heated topic. Muhammad himself worked as an apprentice. He was brought up by a Jewish family in the Jewish tribe, and he liked what he saw. He nearly got married to one of the Jewish girls. Then he invented his own version of monotheism, and he got very broigus with the Jews for not accepting his version. And he organized an enormous massacre at Khaybar. And the Muslims today sing this, Ya Khaybar, Khaybar al-Mut al-Yahud. And so we should be enlightened. Jews lived in what is now Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, a long time ago.
I would just say that my chart really compared 1948 with today, and it didn't go as far back as the 7th century, but you're absolutely right. The Jews were ethnically cleansed from Arabia, but there were still communities at the southern tip in Yemen. But actually, Jews did become Saudis I think it's like between 1937 and 1942, there was a small part of Yemen that became Saudi territory.
True.
So I think they're called Najran, the Jews of Najran. Very interesting people, actually, because they were actually the bodyguards for the rulers of that area, because the bodyguards didn't trust their fellow Arabs. They only trusted the Jews.
The second topic,
Okay.
very brief.
Dalia, you've got your hand up.
Yes,
Hello.
I do. I don't normally ask questions, but Lyn, it was really interesting. I've always been one of the people saying the Holocaust didn't affect Sephardi people. So that was very interesting to hear that there were labor camps, you said, in
Yeah. In
Yeah.
Morocco. Well, it was on the border of Morocco and Algeria, and there were about 2,000 Jews, mostly European Jews, who were building the Trans-Sahara Railway, and the conditions were absolutely atrocious, and many people did die. But this is hardly known. Hardly known.
The other thing,
Yeah.
the Jews from Libya were sent to Bergen-Belsen. They had British passports, so they were kind of British nationality, so they were more held as hostages, and most of them came back. In Iraq, there was a Nazi-inspired coup. The Mufti had plans to kill all the Jews of the Middle East. And if you go to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the Germans include all the Jews in French North Africa amongst being part of Europe's Jewish population.
No, but the museum in Berlin says it's a memorial to the Jews of Europe. They don't acknowledge that Jews outside Europe also suffered from
on the map
from the Nazis.
On the map, they have all the Jews in the French colonies of Algeria and Morocco.
The Germans fully intended to exterminate the Jews of North Africa and the Middle East. Yeah, if you look at
we are from Iran, and my mother is from Mashhad, was born in Mashhad in Iran, and she was one of the people who lived in those tents because they were evacuated when she was 12 years old, and they were taken. It's all she calls it Aliyat Noah, but I presume that's Youth Aliyah now these days. I'm not sure, but they had to hide in a place for a few weeks until they were actually taken. And hide in some graves as children. I mean, there are some horrendous stories.
Amazing stories, which are not known.
No, not known at all. Not known at all. But my question actually is, how did you get into this?
Well, my parents actually came from Baghdad, Iraq, in 1950, but they settled in England as opposed to Israel. Because 95% of the Jews of Iraq ended up in Israel. But while I was growing up, I still had relatives in Baghdad. And in 1967, the Six-Day War broke out, and the Iraqi Jews became victims of a terrible campaign of terror by the Iraqi regime. And I had my aunt there and cousins, and I remember that period very well. So, nine Jews were hanged on trumped up spying charges in Liberation Square in Baghdad, and so the community had to get out. They had to be smuggled out. Actually, 2,000 Jews were smuggled out through Kurdistan with the help of Israel. And actually today we were in a taxi, and the driver was from Iran, from Tehran, and he left, I think in the 1980s, and he described how he was smuggled out through Pakistan. And I said, well, how was it? And he said, it was arranged by the Jewish agency. They paid the smugglers. And I think it went quite smoothly because he didn't have anything much to say about it.
Thank you so much, Lyn. Can I now ask our Managing Director, Steve Winston, to propose a vote of thanks? But don't go away, because I've got some announcements to make afterwards. Steve.
Hi, Lyn. It's always a fascinating subject, and like you say, it's one that is so underrepresented in history. And any talk of refugees, when you're talking about Israel, always hyper focuses on the Palestinians and never on the sort of almost 1 million Jews who were ethnically cleansed from all those lands. Yeah, it would be wonderful to think that we can do more for schools here and in Israel. But thank you for your efforts. I think on behalf of us all here, it's certainly an eye opener when you look at the figures. It's just staggering. It's just something one cannot comprehend. Thank you for joining us earlier than anticipated. That's much appreciated. It's obviously, it's a lot later in Israel for you, but thank you for speaking, and we look forward to welcoming you back soon.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you, Steve.
For having me.
I have to apologise to everyone about the absence of Fiaz Mughal. Apparently had some major internet problems, just been unable to connect. But as I promised everyone, I'm just going to tell you about, we've got 5 more meetings planned in March, April and May. I'm just going to tell you what they are. The first meeting is March the 21st. We have another 3 guest speakers. Dr. Alan Mendoza, who is going to talk about Iran, the threat from Iran and all matters to do with Iran. We have an interesting speaker, Yossi Saunders, who some of you might know, definitely know who he is. He is the owner of the Jewish Weekly newspaper. It's very much the new kid on the block in the Jewish media, trying to take on the Jewish news and even the Jewish Chronicle. And he's going to tell you all about what it's like to run a Jewish newspaper, and it's actually doing quite well. And we're also going to have from Israel Ashley Perry, who will give us an update on the latest developments going on in Israel. And he's an Israeli government advisor. That's the first meeting. That's the 21st of March. On the 26th of March, just 5 days later, we're going to have a debate. It's a Sunday morning. And it will be on the situation with in Israel with regard to the Supreme Court and other contentious matters. In fact, all contentious matters going on in Israel at the moment. What we're going to have is Natasha House, who's a prominent lawyer, speak to us without taking sides, both setting out the case for the legal changes in Israel and the case against. And then we invite the audience to make speeches giving their point of view, because obviously, after all, the National Jewish Assembly, it's for you to have your opportunity to speak. And I can't think at the moment of too many issues that are more pressing for Jews than that. The next event will be the first time that the NJA will have a government minister speaking. There will be just one speaker, and it's a lady called Sarah Dines, who you might not have heard of yet, maybe some of you have. She's a Home Office minister. She only joined the Home Office team just a couple of months, I think 3 or 4 months ago, shortly after Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. And she will be speaking on Tuesday, the 18th of April, and she will be interviewed by Dr. Alan Mendoza. And you will have your chance to talk to her about anti-Semitism and all matters that concern you, which are in the Home Office domain. So it's the first time that the NJA will be getting a government minister. The 4th meeting is the one which you really want to plug. On the 26th of April, we're having a party. It will be a Yom Ha'atzmaut party at one of the major North London synagogues. We're hoping to get 300 or so people to come, and tickets are going to be available very soon. Are they already available, Dali, or not quite yet?
Yes, they're already online.
All right, good.
Online.
Thanks.
It's £15 for adults and £10 for children and concessions.
Lovely. That is the day of Yom Ha'atzmaut. It's Israel's 75th birthday party. I don't think there's any other organisation that's actually organising a Yom Ha'atzmaut party actually on the day. So we're at the moment talking to various other Zionists to get them to help participate as well. And the last meeting, rather topical, on the Tuesday, the 9th of May, the day after the coronation, will be an in-person interview with a certain man by the name of Lee Anderson. Some of you might know that Lee Anderson is the deputy chair of the Conservative Party. And he's going to talk about Britain and Israel, what we have in common, what we don't have in common, and our future relationship. And that will be at a North London venue. I don't yet know which, it's not been finalised. And he will be interviewed by Johnny Gould, who runs some of the podcasts that you might have been watching. So all in all, 5 more meetings, March, April, May. We hope you come to all of them, or at least as many of them as you can come. On that note, and by the way, if it's not all on the website yet, it will be very soon. So on that note, can I once again thank Lyn and thank all of you for coming tonight. Wish you an enjoyable rest of the evening, and hope to see you all on the 21st of March, which is, I think it's a Tuesday, is it, or is it Wednesday? I
Tuesday.
think it's a Tuesday, 21st of March, for the next 3 guest speakers. Thank you so much. Good night.